Genealogy of Jesus is found in Matthew 1, chapter 1, verses 1 to 17. And we're making our way through the descendants in the same order as they occur in the Bible. So we've had a look at Abraham already, and we've had a look at his son Isaac and Jacob, and of course now we're at that part of the journey where we're coming to the tail end of Jacob's journey, and we start to see the formation of the 12 brothers who will become the future heads of the tribes of Israel. So that's where we're up to. So last week we had a look at the circumstances around Jacob when he returned from Laban up in northern Mesopotamia, and how all of the things that he had done with his mother to deceive his father into the blessing, how it turned into a 20-year consequence for him. God's covenant was still fulfilled, of course, but the pathway to receiving it was a long and convoluted one, and of course he ended up experiencing a lot of trouble. So just to recap, he went up there and met the daughter whom he fell in love with, Rachel, and of course he asked for her hand in marriage, and so Laban kindly said, well, if you work for me for 7 years you can have her hand in marriage. But of course when the time came, the evening of the wedding, Laban sent in his other daughter Leah instead and deceived Jacob in the same way that he'd been the deceiver in the past with his mother. And of course the consequence was he found himself married to the elder daughter. Of course Laban says, well, it's custom that you don't marry the youngest, you marry the oldest first. However, if you want to stick around for another 7 years, you can then marry the one that you love, Rachel. So of course he says yes, so he stays for another 7 years. So he ends up bound for 14 years there at that point in time. And then of course all the issues start to happen in relation to having children. So he loved Rachel the most, but of course, as God often does, he favoured Leah, and Leah had 4 children in sequence, and of course Rachel wasn't able to have any children. So Rachel puts forward her slave maidservant who has 2 children, and so Leah comes back with her maidservant and she has 2 children, and of course at the end of the day Rachel still hadn't had any children. So finally she does. She has a son Benjamin before they leave, and then he packs up and he takes off because he realises that Laban has no intention of letting him go. There was the conversation around the provision of wealth. So he had all the goats and the sheep, and how he said, well, if you allow me to have the spotted, the striped and the speckled ones, then I'll take those and you keep the rest. Well, of course, Laban, being the kind father-in-law, he had them all taken away 3 days away and hidden from him. So the story tells us about how the bark of 3 different types of trees were put into the water, and when the herds went there to drink, they would mate, and of course the young would be born and they would have these stripes and speckles, etc. So then he would put them aside. So by the time he left, he ended up fairly wealthy, but he did steal away in the night because he didn't trust Laban. Now when he did leave, however, he did honour God, because God did actually say that you're okay to go. So he didn't leave until God actually told him to. So he left. Laban chased him down, and then they had this situation where they made a covenant between them, and they left on mutual terms. Of course, following that, we had Jacob, who then went ahead with his people, went to go across the Jordan River, sent his family first and stayed behind, and of course this is the night where he wrestled with the Lord, and his name was changed to Israel. So we covered all of that last week. So he then went back into the land of Canaan, and he went up to Shechem, where his daughter Dinah got herself into some trouble because she was to remain behind in the tents, and of course the men were out. They purchased some land there, and she ended up being taken, and she was raped, and then all the circumstances happened whereby the chief, who was called Shechem, said, well, my son would like to marry your daughter. So the other brothers weren't very happy about it. So of course they organised that if they wanted to marry, that they'd have to follow their ritual laws, and they said, well, you'll have to get circumcised if you want to be part of the family. So of course they endured circumcision, And after a couple of days of being sawn in the tents, the brothers went in and killed them all. And so they ended up in a spot of bother, didn't they? So they had to leave. What else happened was they discovered all of the idols, and so the idols had to be destroyed, and then they were told to actually move on. So that's roughly where we pick up with the story tonight. So that's just a bit of a background. So we're just going to... Is there any questions on that at this point in time? So there's a big lesson last week. It covers a lot of territory. Tonight's lesson's a lot more specific because very specific events happen. We also talked about the fact that some people have greater stories in the Bible. There seems to be more events that are circulating at the time. And in fact, Jacob was actually promised that he would have communities of people when he was actually given his covenant promise, which speaks into the fact that he had these 12 children who would become the 12 nations of Israel. So just picking up from Genesis chapter 35 verse 10, it says that after Jacob returned from Paddan Aram, God appeared to him again and blessed him, and he said, "Your name is Jacob, but you will no longer be called Jacob, your name will be Israel." So Jacob, who had struggled in the womb when he grasped the heel of his older twin brother Esau, had his name changed to Israel after he struggled with God. So both of his names were involved with the struggle. So arriving back in Bethel, so you may remember they were told to move on from where they were living with the Shechemites after they basically murdered them all, and God had told them to go back to Bethel. Okay, so Bethel, of course, was the place where he had his dream with the stairway, with the angels, and he received his personal covenant from God. So it changed hands from Abraham to Isaac and now to Jacob. So arriving back in Bethel, God renewed the covenant again, and he says in verses 11 to 12, "I am God Almighty, El Shaddai. Be fruitful and increase in number. A nation and a community of nations will come from you," so there's that community word, "and kings will come from your body." So once again, with these revelations with covenant, God always reveals more as each step goes on. He doesn't always tell you everything up front. So here we find once again, we've got this introduction now that kings will come. It goes on to say, "The land I gave to Abraham and Isaac I also give to you, and I will give this land to your descendants after you." So there's the land of the covenant promise. Then God left him, and Jacob built an altar there again. So in Genesis 35 verse 7 it says, "And he called the place El Bethel, because it was there that God revealed himself to him when he was fleeing from his brother." So just as a reminder, does everyone remember what Bethel means? House of God. So Beth or Beit in Hebrew, house, and El, God, so house of God. Okay, so both Abraham and Isaac had only one son of promise. When God said, "Be fruitful and increase in number," the time had come for increase. This was fulfilled with the 12 sons of Jacob, who become the 12 tribes of Israel. The nation and community of nations represented the nation of Israel to come by his name, and the community of nations by the 12 sons of tribes. The kings to come not only represent the future kings of Israel and Judah, but ultimately the Messiah himself. In fact, all his future posterity were kings and priests, and in Exodus 19:6 it talks about a kingdom of priests. Okay, so we're getting a picture of what's going to occur in the future. So whilst in Bethel, Rachel became pregnant. So at this point in time when they arrived back, there was only the 11 boys and the daughter Dinah. So she falls pregnant. Her request to the Lord to be blessed with another son was fulfilled. So before she left northern Mesopotamia, and she'd already had Joseph, she'd asked to be blessed with another child. Jacob decided to move again, and on the road to Ephrath, which is in Bethlehem, Rachel died after a difficult birth. She named the boy Ben-Oni. So here's one for the scholars. What does Ben-Oni mean? Anyone know what Ben means?
Son of my sorrow.
Son of my sorrow.
Yeah.
So Ben, so always a nice example to use today. Yeah, most people know the name Osama bin Laden. Okay, so Osama, son of Laden, that's how the names are. It's still used to this day in the Middle East. So when we're reading the Bible and we see these words, Ben always means son of. So only means my sorrow, so hence the name means son of my sorrow. So as she took her last breath, Jacob decided that this name was not a good name. Right? Why would your child? She was obviously reflecting on her situation, feeling sorrowful. She was passing away. She was giving birth to her son, but he didn't want this child to wear that as a mantle through life. So he changed the name to Benjamin. So again, we've got Benjamin. So we have the meaning of that name is a son or son of, or son who. Anyone knows what his name means?
Right hand.
Sorry, say again.
It says here it's the son of the right hand.
Son of the right hand. Yeah, it's going to depend on your Bible version you're reading, but it says a son who will be fortunate. Okay, so he's going to be blessed. So we can look at that more later. So after burying his beloved wife, Jacob set up a pillar to mark her tomb and took her 12th and last son, the only one born in Canaan, and went to Migdal Eder, just outside Bethlehem. Now Migdal means fortress in Hebrew, so this was actually a fortress place. So I've got a picture up here, which I'll pass around. We'll post this on the YouTube video. But this is a picture of Rachel's tomb. So this was taken in the early 1900s, so this is how much it's actually changed over there. When you go to Israel today, that building's still there, but it's enclosed in another building, as they like to do. So you drive past it on the road, you can't see it, but that building exists. So he moved back there. So this is where the family had been for some time now. And he lived in the land where his father stayed, it says. And then at this point in time, so that sort of brings us to the end of that journey. So we find that he arrives, he's now got 12 sons, he's got his daughter, and they've gone back to the family home, so to speak. And then the Bible switches from this point and it now focuses on the journey of the sons and in specifically Joseph. So we find that in the Bible it tends to have a lot of context. So we follow a person's journey and then it flips to somebody else and somebody else. So the idea of this study is to actually follow the journey by the actual context of the people that it writes about. Sometimes when people get the Bible wrong is because they're not actually got the right context. They're viewing it from the wrong perspective. Okay, so from this point in time, we turn to Jacob's son Joseph. Now it's interesting, isn't it? Because Judah is actually the son who will be the next heir, if you will, of the covenant. So he's the fourth born son, and yet the Bible focuses on Joseph. Why do you think the Bible moves to Joseph first?
Because he got given that birthright. He was taken away from Reuben because he had sinned.
Yep.
And because he was his father's favourite son.
Yes. Yes.
Because when he's spoken, he's about 17 years old. We'll pick up the story, but
yep.
he is the one that had the birthright now because his son got taken that away for sin.
Yep. So let's change perspective and step back into a bigger picture. Because part of what happens when we read the Bible often is we read all of the micro stories, but we forget to see God's plan, the big picture that's going on. So we step back and we think God's plan. What's God's plan? Why does Joseph get put forward now as the next person that's spoken about? What's about to happen? Why Joseph?
Because he's, which one does it go? I suppose because he's the one that is going to help the family when all the problem arrive, that they move. He was going to have the favor with the king and all of that sense.
Okay, so be more specific. So he's going to go into slavery. Right? He's going to go down to Egypt. So that wasn't just a circumstance of Joseph and his brothers not getting along, was it? There was something much bigger that was going on here. So that's the one thing to actually acknowledge. What about the other thing? What about the fact that these boys are meant to form God's covenant nation? 12 tribes. How are they doing as brothers? What happens when Joseph is favoured by his father? Benjamin likewise is favoured, and all the other boys are standing over here jealous, looking at them, and they're all scheming. They're not united, are they? So we see amongst these brothers that are meant to inherit God's nation that they could never form a nation in reality. They can't even get along with each other. How are they going to stand together in the future when they don't get along with each other? So part of the journey that the Bible's coming up with now is we learn about sometimes God puts this huge adversity on people, and what it actually does is take away all the details of their life, all their differences, all their qualms, and it submits them to the same, what can we say? It becomes cruelty, the same, what's the word I'm looking for? They're submitted to circumstances which are difficult, things that oppress them is probably the word. They're going to be oppressed. So often what happens is when we're oppressed together, we actually come together, we put aside all of our differences, and then we actually unite to go forward. So we look at past history like world wars, for example. There's nations who didn't get along, but boy, when they had a common threat like Adolf Hitler, boy, do people stand together all of a sudden, sort out their differences and fight a common enemy. So it formed them into a body of people. This is how the United Nations started, with that heart. So back here, in order to unite these people, God's plan, he knew that they weren't united. He knew there was going to be issues. And so his plan begins to unfold where he sends Joseph ahead in order to prepare for what's going to come. And hence this is the next significant part of this journey. So as David mentioned, at this point in time, Joseph's a young man. He's aged 17. And he's tending his father's flocks with his brothers. It seems to be the thing to do in those days. That's where the wealth was, so they were all tending animals. So born in his father's old age, he was loved more than his brothers. So Jacob, now called Israel, made a richly ornamented robe for him, and his brothers hated him. So smart move by his dad. Here, I'll give you this beautiful robe, and everyone else in this room is going to wear daggy clothes. So not going to go down well, isn't it? Because he's going to be seen as being favoured, but that's of course what happened. But it goes from there, even becomes more dire. So Joseph begins to have dreams, or the Bible tells us of the dreams. And he had two dreams that are revealed to them. So in Genesis 37 verse 7, the first one, he said, "We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood up straight, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it." So here's Joseph, 17-year-old, second youngest, in his flash robe saying, "You're all going to bow down to me. How you going, brothers?" So obviously they're not going to be very happy, are they? So of course this dream just caused more hatred from his brothers. So they asked in verse 8, "Do you intend to reign over us?" So they got the message pretty loud and clear. So in his second dream, he recounted how he saw the sun, the moon, and 11 stars, very specific, bow down to him. This dream he also told to his father, who scolded him in verse 10 and said, "Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you?" Well, this is a bit odd, isn't it? Didn't his father favour him, like him the most? And yet now he's actually standing back going, "Oh, hang on a second, that's a bit much." So even he's finding this a little bit confronting, that this dream would see him bowing down as well. But his father kept it in mind. His brothers, however, were just jealous of him. I just have another little picky here just to pass around. It's just an old picture, but you can have a look. You can imagine the Joseph sitting there with his brothers gathered around him, and them all looking up at him, almost looking at him like he's skiting to them.
Can I just add something there that we
Sure.
need to, and I've been praying and thinking about this for a couple of days.
Right.
It's what we just mentioned, hatred. How the damage that it causes, and how hard it is to, I wouldn't use the word fix, because it's not something that you fix out, something that is so broken. But how that affects nations. Example, even now, look at our nation of Chile. And you read the report, and the hatred that has, I'm not saying who's in the right, who's in the wrong. We're talking about the outcome of all what has happened. You have sowed hatred.
Yes.
Okay? And I've been asking the Lord, how can we as Christians fix that? How can we do it? It really needs to be done in a supernatural way from God.
Right. I mean, you look at Adolf Hitler's story. I mean, it came out of economic depression as a result of losing the First World War, even though they were the aggressors.
Yep.
But he took the stance that we're being oppressed by everybody else, it's unjust. And even though they knew this guy was, you know, not a good guy, they sort of went along one step and went along one step until all of a sudden they actually couldn't come back from it because power had been given to others. And I think this is one of the common things that actually happens. You know, they talk about, you know, in the situation of World War II, how, you know, it started off with the oppression of social groups. You know, it wasn't all just about the Jews. They oppressed groups of people socially. They took people who had authority out of action. And there was people who stood by, who knew it was wrong, but because they weren't being affected themselves, they didn't actually step forward and say, we need to stop this. And there was people who were men of God in the church in Germany who stood aside and said, well, they're persecuting the Jews, it's okay. I'm a Christian and, you know, we're still part of the church, and Adolf Hitler is still somehow weirdly connected to us. And then it got to the point where they got taken out. And then they had no one left to stand for them because they were the only ones left standing, because they allowed everybody else to actually take their turn. I think when we get to a lot of these situations when something bubbles over, all of this stuff has happened before it because nobody did anything about it, you know. And you have countries, you know, in Pinochet, you have countries where you think, wow, this is shocking, that'll never happen again. And yet 20 years, 30 years later, you find it up it comes again. So it tells you that the actual conflict, whatever the issues were never resolved because it comes up in another form again. So we all have a responsibility to make sure in our societies that those things can't happen again. You know, but if people don't walk with the Lord and they don't have moral values, etc., then who's going to stop it? You know, we live in a world today where, you know, we're all aware of this. You know, there's issues going on right now which are appalling, but everybody's been quiet about it. And then suddenly everybody's making a noise about it, but it's almost like it's too late. And we live in a world where the minorities are persecuted by the media. The majorities are persecuted by the media, and the minorities, if you say anything against them, you're being unjust to them. And so they're getting all of this inflated power almost out of public humiliation rather than what's right and what's wrong. And I think, you know, a lot of things could be easily solved if people would just communicate, you know. So, but yeah, it's very, very valid, David. Thank you. So we sort of move on now to the story of Judah, as said, and Joseph, because we're following the genealogy of Jesus. I mentioned when we first started this course that the genealogy of Jesus, if you look at each verse, it's actually divided up into periods of time aligned with the biblical history. So the first verse talks about the connection between Abraham, King David and Jesus, fulfilling a prophecy. The second verse has the patriarchs Abraham, Isaac and Jacob. And then the next verse, when we go into it, we start to enter into Judah and then his descendants from there. Okay, so we find that at this point in time, if we actually follow the person and their journey in the Bible, because they're placed in the genealogy of Jesus and they're a forefather of Jesus for a reason, and the circumstances that surround it actually lets us have a different lens on having a look at what the Bible is talking about. Because as we've been finding out, in Jesus' forefathers, the bloodline descendancy is far from perfect. And here we are again, we're going to go into one particularly bad chapter. And in fact, in this particular part with Judah, we find that Tamar, who he has children with, who's his daughter-in-law, in fact ends up in the genealogy of Jesus. One of the 4 women that's listed there. So we're going to have a look at this. So Jacob's 4th son was born in succession by Leah. So Judah is the son of Leah. Leah's sister Rachel becomes extremely jealous and tells Jacob in Genesis 31, says, "Give me children or I'll die." So it's a very severe statement. From all that transpires, Jacob understands that he's not in control and answers her angrily in verse 2, "Am I in the place of God who has kept you from having children?" So we have this personal interaction in this circumstance with Jacob and Leah and Rachel, where they start to actually contest who's in control, because Rachel's demanding children and he's saying, "Am I like God? Can I actually do this?" Because we talked about last week how the children are actually a blessing of God. Right? God tells us to go out and to multiply. Part of his blessing is to have the next generation. And so in this circumstance, Jacob's realising with everything that's transpired to him that he's definitely not in control. And so he points to God. So Judah and his brothers, with the exception of Joseph and Benjamin, they left Mamre. So this is where the Bible takes on to this new journey with Joseph. They left Mamre and drove their father's flocks northwards. They followed this highway called the Way to Shua, passing through the hill country to look for better grazing. So they went up north through Shechem. They continued northwards to a place called Tirzah, where they moved their flocks northwestly until they found good grazing at a place called Dothan. Now, I'm going to pass this map around for you to have a look. This shows you all of the pathway that they travel and where Dothan is. And so just have a good look at that and it'll familiarise yourself with all of these names that we're actually talking about. Now, when they left, they said they were going to Shechem, okay? But of course they didn't stay at Shechem, they moved on to Dothan. So when Joseph's sent to go looking for them, he doesn't find them there. So why did they go to Dothan? So I like to have a look at these things and find out why people go to these places. So Dothan actually, we can find out historically, it actually had a well-built fortress there, and they give you details, like they have 10 rooms, they've got thick protective city wall, 25 feet high, 7.5 metres near the gateway. They had a wide stairway leading up to this gateway, but there was no spring inside the city. And this is what's unique about this story. In the Bible, when we read about all of the locations for all the cities, every single one is located where there's water. Right? No water, no city, no town. Many of these towns are actually built with the water inside, but many of them weren't. They in fact had the water just outside the entrance. So if you go to the Tel in Beersheba today, you'll see there's a well right at the front gate. And the reason for that is because the people who had livestock, they could actually come up to the entrance, they could water their animals without actually going into the town itself. But the water was just outside, so the townsfolk could come outside the gate, the people from outside to come up to the gate and they could receive this water. This particular place, there was no water where it was actually built. So of course, you've got to remember they've got herds and they're looking for water and they're looking for grass. Sorry Kaz, I can see you having a bit of a...
I'm always cold.
That's all right. We'll adjust it.
Jim would probably be
very happy. Yeah. So there was no spring inside the city. So the reason I mention these things is there's a real practicality to the Bible. It gives you a lot of information, a lot of detail. So if we take every word as valuable as the Word of God and we actually look into it, we find out there's a reason behind everything. And so here's this place, Dothan. If I asked everybody where Dothan is out of context, I don't think anyone would even know what I'm talking about. And yet here it is, it's actually a major event in the biblical history happens in this place. So there's no spring inside the city, so the water had to be hauled from a well, and the well was actually a few hundred feet away. It's 120 metres down the slope in the plain of Dothan. There was 2 wells dug there to supply water for the needs of the city and its livestock. That's history, right? That's geography, that's archaeology. There was a city there was 2 wells 120 metres outside the gate. There was a valley and there was also a river through this area. Okay, so we paint the setting for where they actually took these animals. Now, it's suggested that the name Dothan actually means 2 wells. So again, the Bible, it always names things, so it talks about 2 wells. When we get to the story when Joseph comes, what happened? They put him in an empty cistern or well. So there's probably one with water and one was actually empty. So it connects to the biblical story that there was actually a well there to put Joseph into, historically ratified. So there's a significant connection is made to the plight of Joseph here, as I said, because archaeological records give us an understanding of this city of Dothan. Okay, so Judah's journey with his brothers, it wouldn't have been fast. You've got to remember, when they're travelling in these days, right, with livestock, there's no highways, there's no vehicles. They estimate that the most you could probably move is about 9 k's in a day, 9 kilometres, you know, moving your animals along. So when you go to Israel, the distances between places aren't very long. Today's term, we jump in a car, we drive for 20 minutes, we're pretty much there. But in these days, it would have been several days' journey to do the same. So when they arrived, they didn't stay in the city, as I mentioned, but they drove their flocks on into the Dothan Valley, where Judah pitched his tent with his brothers. There's lots of grazing there and seasonal rain causing this water to flow and fill these wells. So Jacob called his son Joseph to him, and he said in verses 13 to 14 of Genesis 37, "As you know, your brothers are grazing flocks near Shechem. Come, I am going to send you to them." "Very well," he replied. So he said to him, "Go and see if all is well with your brothers and with the flocks, and bring word back to me." Jacob sent Joseph north to look for his brothers from Mamre in the valley of Hebron, where he was. Now understand that Jacob's sending a 17-year-old boy, so this is the context thing again. He's got a solo 17-year-old boy in his flash robes, and he says, "Off you go on your own through this hostile land and go and find your brothers." So it tells you, now the distance there is actually 100 kilometres, 63 miles between the two locations. So that's a long way in those days. It's nowhere near, a quick journey to get them back or find. So he sends them all this way to check on his mature son. So you've got to say that this is pretty extraordinary. You know, first of all, they went so far to graze their flocks, but secondly, that he'd send his son on his own to go all of this way. So Jacob's decision says to us that there was a trust that he actually had in the Lord. He must have trusted the Lord if he's willing to send his son so far away. Remember, there's a covenant over this family all the time. Through all this story, there's a protection that's required. So Joseph, obviously, he went north the same way, and he reached Shechem, where he expected to find his brothers because his father said he'd be there. But when he arrived, he was unable to find them anywhere. So he was seen there by a man who saw him wandering around the fields in his richly ornamented robe. So he would have been kind of odd. And then this is where everything starts to change. Everything goes pear-shaped from Joseph's point of view. So Judah and his brothers, they're tending their flocks, and they spotted Joseph heading towards them in the distance. They obviously knew who it was straight away because of his robe in the distance. He must have stood out. And they were obviously jealous of their younger brother, knowing that their father loved him more. So he even revealed a dream to them, which they understood meant he would rule over them one day. So they're obviously not happy with him. They hated him, and before he reached them, they saw an opportunity, so they began to speak to one another. They were a long way from home, and the watchful eyes of their father wasn't around. So in verses 19 to 20, it says, "Here comes that dreamer." So obviously he revealed dreams to them, so they go, "Here comes the dreamer." Sounds like an Aussie thing to say, doesn't it? So it says, "Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of those cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him." Remember I said there was 2 wells? The scripture tells us cisterns, 2. "Then we'll see what comes of his dreams." So before he gets there, they're already plotting against him. The only one to protest was Reuben. He suggested holding Joseph unhurt in the empty water cistern rather than dumping his dead body in one. He planned to rescue him later and take him to their father. He didn't want to be any part of it, so he upped and left. When Joseph arrived, so there's only 10 brothers there now, 9 brothers. So Judah and his brothers stripped the robe from him that they hated so much. They had listened to Reuben. They did not kill him, but threw him into an empty cistern. After they dealt with Joseph, Judah sat down with his brothers to eat a meal, but could not help but notice a caravan of Ishmaelites. So here's the connection with their past family. And they're coming along on their camels from Gilead in the east over the Jordan River. Looking up, they noticed the camels were heavy laden with the spices, balm and myrrh, and the traders were heading west to the coast of the Mediterranean Sea to follow southwards down to Egypt. So after Judah's older brother Reuben had insisted, let's not take his life, don't shed any blood, he said to his brothers, what will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our own brother, our own flesh and blood. What a kind brother. Let's just sell him into some foreign land as a slave, and then we've done the right thing. We haven't killed him. So this didn't sit well with his conscience, nor with his brothers. So we're talking about Judah. The Ishmaelite traders were merchants from Midian, where they came by their brothers, pulled Joseph up out of the system and sold him for a mere 20 shekels of silver. So Judah obviously stood and watched with his brothers as his little brother Joseph would have been looking at them all going, what are you doing? You know? So we could question at that point in time, did Joseph know what his future journey looked like? Had the Lord actually revealed to him what his purpose was in all of this? He was the one who had the dreams and prophesied that they would bow down to him. But in this particular point in time, I don't think he actually knew what that actually looked like in the future. So perhaps those dreams that he'd revealed, he might have been questioning them at this point in time. Well, how am I going to be ruling over them if I'm being taken away and sold off into slavery at this point in time? So later when Reuben returned and looked down into the cistern to see Joseph was no longer there, he began to fear and worry. And he said in verse 30, the boy isn't there, where can I turn now? So we find out with Reuben that he's now worried about who? Himself. Where can I turn now? So in these situations when things go wrong, instead of people worrying about those who are affected, they actually worry about what's it going to look like for them and the role that they had in it. Because he's now thinking, when I go back to my dad, what am I going to say? What am I going to do? So he's in this situation because he didn't agree with it, and yet he's complicit because he was with them. So instead of standing with them and doing something about it, what did he do? He said, I'm going to take off here and have nothing to do with it. Okay, so this is one of those moments where we talked about before, where someone can stand the breach, stand the gap and do something, or we can just take off and leave it alone. So to cover their sin, they took Joseph's unique robe, and after slaughtering a goat, they dipped it in the animal's blood. Satisfied they'd done what was necessary, they drove their father's flocks back home, down the way to Shua, and as they headed southwards through the hill country, you can imagine their mood would have turned very sombre as they were approaching their father, thinking, what are we going to say? So, and they obviously headed back to their camp at Mamre. So, getting the bloodstained ornamented robe from one of their saddlebags, the brothers went to see their father. So they would have exchanged greetings, and you can imagine with their downcast eyes, they gave the robe to the father. And in verse 32, they say to him, we found this, examine it to see whether it is your son's robe. So obviously this unique robe, it would have been obvious whose it was. So again, another little picture just for you to have a look, just to sort of bring to life what the scene would have been like a bit. You can imagine Jacob's grief. This is one of the two sons who he loved the most, and he had been taken from him. So of course he recognised it straight away because there was none other like it. So he said, it's my son's robe, some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces, in verse 33. So Jacob tore his own clothes and put on sackcloth, and he mourned for many days, refusing all his sons and daughters' attempts to comfort him, weeping and weeping. Meanwhile, in Egypt, the Midianites sold Joseph to Potiphar, the captain of the king's palace guard. So we come to this juncture in this story, and if we have a look at the Bible, you find that the story is interrupted right here. It doesn't continue on with Joseph and the brothers. It actually takes a turn and it focuses just on Judah. So there's a chapter there on Judah and Tamar. So why do you think it does that? Why do we suddenly stop and focus on Judah and Tamar? Wouldn't it be easier to carry on with that story as it was? So again, thinking about why, we're looking at the canon of Scripture, why are some things in there? Why do they write that? Rather than just reading it and taking in the story, there's a purpose for it actually being in there. It doesn't talk about.
I was just going to say, because at that point of time, he was showing his guilt by leaving his family
Right.
and going off, and that's why it's sort of sidetracked. So
Yeah.
his journey at that particular time,
Yeah.
while Joseph was in prison, he went off and had all what was going on.
Kick some
with Tamar.
dust.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts? But yeah, I agree. Any other thoughts on that? Why do we switch to Judah here? Think about the genealogy of Jesus.
I was just going to say, it's picking up on the lineage again, tracking the lineage through to Jesus.
Yeah. So we find that if we actually keep the genealogy of Jesus, which as I said is like the skeleton for the Bible, you know, from the end of Genesis 11 all the way through, the story follows of the Bible. Everything that happens, all the prophecies, all of the journeys, all of the kings, they're all connected to this genealogy that happens at the end of the day. So Judah's the next person in the genealogy, so it would make sense that they focus on Judah as opposed to all the other brothers, because there's not a chapter in there that speaks for each of the other brothers, they're just treated as a collective. But Judah's story is actually separated from there. Right? But his separation and this story actually gives us the next generation in the genealogy of Jesus, the son Perez. Okay, so we find that there's this specific purpose to that. So we're going to have a look at this. This is an area I don't think I've ever heard this spoken about in church in all my years, because it's an unpleasant story, but it reveals a lot to us. So tonight, so we're going to have a look at this, and then we'll pick up with Joseph again next week. So in the book of Genesis here is the account of Judah and Tamar. It is the only chapter that doesn't follow the sequence of events that affects Joseph personally, or that his family passes through collectively until the death of Jacob. Placed here for a specific purpose, the focus is purely on Judah, telling the story of what happened to him when he's left his family for a while. So Judah left his brothers and his father and the rest of the extended family and went to stay with a man from Adullam named Hira. So on that map that's been passing around, it actually shows where that is on there, so you can have a look, and that will be put online as well. So once there, he met the daughter of a Canaanite man called Shua and married her. So whilst the Holy Bible focuses on how God used Joseph to protect his family and ensure the blessing and the promise of his covenant was preserved, this account of Judah provides us with the only separate story from the other 11 sons. So as I was asking why Judah, again, the genealogy of Jesus is the answer. It was through his seed that the fulfilment of the covenant being passed down to the next generation would occur. And this is confirmed if we look at Genesis 49:10, when Jacob's actually giving the blessings to all of his sons a little bit later. It actually says when Jacob blessed his sons and prophesies that Jesus, the future king, will come from Judah's descendants, he says, the scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet. So we're learning that he has a very special place in the descendancy as a forefather of Jesus. In fact, so much so that it's going to be another prophecy of the Bible that goes all the way through to Jesus himself. So we find some of the prophecies that don't go all the way through to Jesus, they promise the next step, and some of them go all the way through. So when Jacob left his brothers, we learn something of his character. So sometimes in the Bible we read the stories, but we don't know much about the person themselves, their character. But in some sections of the Bible, interactions happen where we find out a bit about what sort of person they actually were. And this is one of the cases here with Judah. So we learn something of his character that could make us wonder why, of all Jacob's sons, did our Lord Jesus Christ descend from him? So as we walk through this journey, as I call it, we'll witness how God's choice is one of grace and not of merit. So this is the point. This is what's important. You know, as we read all through the Old Testament and the journeys and the stories of people, we realise that it's not based on merit. Right? It's based on grace. Christ came into the world to save sinners, but he's not ashamed to be related to them. And obviously in this case we're talking about his very forefathers in terms of relations. So we have to understand that the worthiness of Jesus is personal, it is of himself and not derived from his ancestors. So So when we look at genealogy and we look at the fulfillment of prophecy, it identifies who he is, but it doesn't actually say that that's the reason or the only reason why he is who he is, does it? Because we find out in genealogy that there's a whole pile of things that happen along the way where his parents and his forefathers are not pure, they're not without sin. There is sin nature in all of these people. So it's not for that reason that we actually follow the descendancy. A lot of people today claim things from the past based on the fact that, well, that's my bloodline, so I'm entitled. So when Judah left his brothers and his father's home, he not only left his relationships with his family, but he seemed to walk away from his relationship with God the Father. Although he replaced, remember we're talking about as we've been going on this, that when they're actually walking with the Lord in these days, they would stop, pitch their tent, build an altar, make a sacrifice, pray to the Father. All these things were happening. And yet the times when Abraham walked away and Isaac walked away, there are always times when this actually stops. So we find here that Judah walks away from everything. He walks away from his family, and we don't hear in this story any time that he actually spends with the Lord, or asking him, consulting him, praying to him. There's none whatsoever. And yet he's the son of the future covenant promise. So he not only left his relationships with his family, but he seemed to walk away from this relationship with God the Father. Although he replaced these relationships with a man who worshipped a false god and a marriage without his father's consent. So in those days it was required to have consent to get married. So all of that was just put aside. The account reveals how God was still with Judah, however. Judah's wife bore 3 sons, and Onan, born in Adullam, and Shelah, born in a place called Kezib, which is on the map. We don't know whether Judah's wife embraced the worship of the God of Israel or not, but we learn that there was little fear of God in the family. Judah found a wife by the name of Tamar for his firstborn son So again we learn in the Bible that the father is actually finding the partner for their children. This was the way that was done. Remember, Abraham sent the servant off to find, Isaac did the same, and so here we find the situation recurring again. But the Bible says he was so wicked in the sight of the Lord that God put him to death, in verse 7 of Genesis 38. So Judah married his second son Onan to Er's widow according to the ancient custom, and instructed him, in verse 8, to lie with your brother's wife and fulfill your duty to her as a brother-in-law to produce offspring for your brother. So again we learn about these laws that required the family inheritance to be passed through, and so we have this situation here where the next son is required to actually marry. So if you have an older brother who passes away, your obligation is that you're going to marry your brother's wife. So interesting, eh? Wonder how that would go in today's society. But when we look at the purpose of it, it's about fulfilling their inheritance. That's what it's about, right? Because the first son will actually become what was the inheritance of the father who's now deceased. And so we find these laws. And these, of course, are all written later when they're penned down by Moses. As I was saying last week, all these laws were in place before Moses penned them down. Obviously, society was abiding by God's laws at this time. So in this way, his brother's inheritance and bloodline would carry forward. The custom of marrying the brother's widow later became one of the laws of Moses, which we find in Deuteronomy 25, verse 5. So I'll just read that to you. Here we go. So it says, if brothers are living together and one of them dies without a son, his widow must not marry outside the family. Her husband's brother shall take her and marry her and fulfill the duty of a brother-in-law to her. And here's the pinch point. The first son she bears shall carry on the name of the dead brother, so that his name will not be blotted out from Israel. So we're talking about inheritance, covenant inheritance here. Okay, so these laws actually governed their society. So they knew these laws because of what's actually happening in this part of the story. Any questions at this point? Pretty straightforward. But it says here in verse 9 to 10, it says, but Onan knew that the offspring would not be his. So I want to ask you, how would you like to do this? Well, he's obviously feeling the same way. He's had to marry this woman, but he's not actually clearly happy about it. So it says, but Onan knew that the offspring would not be his, so whenever he lay with his brother's wife, he spilled his semen on the ground to keep from producing offspring for his brother. What he did was wicked in the Lord's sight. Remember the laws that we just read?
Yeah.
And so what did he do? He put him to death also. So here's Judah. He's got 3 sons. His is the covenant promise. And here's 2 of them being put to death by God as wicked. So he's got 1 son left at this point in time. So Judah's 3rd and only remaining son was too young to marry Tamar, so he told her to return to her father's home. She expected she would be given to Shua in marriage when he came of age, but Judah was concerned that he may die too, just like his brothers. So in other words, he didn't want to give her to his son. The other 2 had died when they were married to her, so he probably looks at her perhaps as a bit of a curse. He's only got 1 son left, so he's saying, we're going to keep you separate. So you go back to your family, and we'll pretend something will happen, but we're not actually intending on it happening at all. So Judah's... So with the passing of time, Judah's wife Shua died. He mourned her loss, and when he finally overcame his grief, he decided to journey to Timnah, again on the map, to visit the men there who were shearing his sheep. He took his friend Hirah the Adullamite with him, but Adullam was such a small town that Tamar heard of his plans, so she removed her widow's clothes, disguised herself with a veil, and went to a place called Enaim on the road to Timnah. Knowing that Judah would have to pass by, she sat at the entrance and waited for him. So here's Tamar, his daughter-in-law, who was intent on having a child through this bloodline. Okay? She must have had an understanding of some form of inheritance, I would imagine. She's chasing this very, very hard. Two sons she'd already married to. So by this time, Tamar knew Shelah had grown up, and yet she had not been given to him as a wife. So that's obviously the behind of what's happening, isn't it? She was cognizant of this. So we can ask these questions. Did Judah ever intend to give her to him? Did he suspect she was connected to the death of her 2 former husbands? And was it for this reason he sent her to her father's house to live as a widow? Right? So we start having these thoughts about what's actually going on here in the background. The scripture tells us it was God who slew the brothers. But Judah's negligence in not giving his daughter-in-law to his remaining son Shelah left her exposed to temptation. So the unfulfilled promise by Judah was actually not righteous, because he was actually obliged to give his daughter-in-law to his son. Right? So he's not doing the right thing. So she, of course, as the Bible keeps telling us, sets out to change the course of direction by her own means. So we find in the Bible all of these promises that are given, when they're not fulfilled, people go about their own way of making them happen. So this is quite a mess. 2 dead brothers, and now she's pretending to be a prostitute. So not a good look. So in verses 15 to 16 of Genesis 38, it says, when Judah saw her, he thought she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face. Not realising that she was his daughter-in-law, he went over to her by the roadside and said, come now, let me sleep with you. And what will you give me to sleep with you, she asked. I'll send you a young goat from my flock, he said. Will you give me something as a pledge until you send it, she asked. He asked, what could he give? And she answered, your seal and its cord and the staff in your hand. Judah gave them to his daughter-in-law, and she slept with him. From this union, Tamar became pregnant. So extraordinary, isn't it? It's worth a goat. I guess a goat was a lot in those days, but that's the exchange. That was the coinage in those days. But foolishly, obviously, Judah hands over something personal to identify who he actually was, whereas she actually wore a veil, so he couldn't determine who she was. So Tamar intentionally prostituted herself to Judah. Whether she understood this promise made to Abraham and his seed or not, she earnestly desired to have a child by one of his family, and by so doing she's honoured as one of the 4 mothers of the ancestors of the Messiah, named in the genealogy of Jesus. So if you look at the 4 women that are named in the genealogy of Jesus, they don't actually have wonderful pasts, and yet they're all named. Genealogies in those days were usually always just focused on the men, and yet here we have these specific women who are actually mentioned here. So after sleeping with Judah, Tamar left. She took off her veil and changed back into her widow's clothes. At the same time, Judah sent his friend Hirah the Adullamite back with the goat, but she was nowhere to be found. Hirah asked the local men Where is the shrine prostitute who was beside the road at Enaim? So we find out here that she's actually a shrine prostitute, which says that she's actually somebody who's actually enacting on behalf of a false god. What does the Bible tell us? We had a look at this with all of the idols. God said not to intermarry, not to sleep with women who were worshipping false gods. And so she's here actually enacting a shrine prostitute. So the very son of Jacob, who's met face to face with God, who will become the future descendant of Messiah, is sleeping with a shrine prostitute who worships a false god. So it's extraordinary, isn't it? So we learn something about Judah's character here, for he thought nothing of sleeping with a shrine prostitute. Clearly this is a reflection on his walk with the Lord. He's clearly not walking with the Lord here at all. It didn't take much to tempt him to sleep with another woman after his wife died either, and it didn't seem to bother him that he slept with a woman whom he believed practiced prostitution and worship of another god. It says a lot about who he was as a person at that time. So the Bible goes on to say in verses 24 to 26 in Genesis 38, about 3 months later, Judah was told, "Your daughter-in-law Tamar is guilty of prostitution, and as a result she is now pregnant." Judah said, "Bring her out and have her burned to death." What a guy. As she was being brought out, she sent a message to her father-in-law and said, "I am pregnant by the man who owns these," she said. And she added, "See if you recognise whose seal and cord and staff these are." Judah recognised them and said, "She is more righteous than I, since I wouldn't give her to my son Shelah." So we have this extraordinary situation where he is very happy to sleep with a prostitute, but publicly renounce her and say, have her burnt to death, and yet he's the person who is happy to actually be with her. So it says a lot about his character, and we talk about these situations today. Well, it's extraordinary what people actually do to cover up things that they've done wrong. Willing to kill other people. So Judah's sin with Tamar, at that point, it ended there, and this is where the story starts to shift back to him returning home again. So we learn here that Judah had no intention of letting his son marry Tamar. So although the means didn't justify the end, her sinful action was pardoned and her good intention was accepted by the grace of God. Because remember, she actually committed a sin here as well. Mm-hmm. Right? And yet she becomes the mother of a child who will become part of the genealogy of Jesus. It was customary for prostitutes to cover their faces, so Judah did not know who she was, but he was willfully guilty of fornication, for he knew she was not his wife and not to be touched. Those of us who act as though we are righteous and pure and yet sin before God are hypocrites. Judah was publicly humiliated by Tamar when she was able to prove his sin. By revealing his possessions, she was also able to prove the unborn children. For she was pregnant with twins, were descendants of the seed of promise originally given to Abraham. So Shelah is not going to be the father, it's going to be one of these two children. In verses 27 to 30, just about finished, when the time came for her to give birth, there were twin boys in her womb. As she was giving birth, one of them put out his hand, so the midwife took a scarlet thread and tied it on his wrist and said, "This one came out first." I always find this very humorous that she had the presence of mind in the middle of childbirth. Oh, hang on, I'll just get this thread tied around this baby's hand, and the hand goes back inside again. It's a pretty extraordinary story in itself, isn't it? But when he drew back in his hand, the brother came out, she said, "So this is how you have broken out." And he was named Perez. Then his brother, who had the scarlet thread on his wrist, came out, and he was given the name Zerah. So the birth of Perez and Zerah was hard for the mother. The children, like Jacob and Esau, struggled for the birthright. So we have another one of these stories where who's coming out first, who's going to have the birthright. But Perez obtained it, and he was named first. Zerah is the only son named in person in a genealogy of Jesus that wasn't to be one of the ancestors of Jesus. So once again in the genealogy we have this unique outcome from this very moment. Now the name Perez describes the outcome of the birth because it actually means breaking out. So once again, biblical names always describe a purpose or a meaning or a place. And despite the hand of his brother appearing first, Perez was the first to be born. In a manner of speaking, he was the first to break out of the womb. His brother Zerah was so named because of the events surrounding his birth. His name means scarlet or brightness, a title indicative of the scarlet thread that was wrapped around his wrist. Okay, so that brings us to the end of where we're going to tonight. So we return back to Joseph and his story when he goes to Potiphar, the captain of the Pharaoh's guard, next week. So the things from tonight that we see is that there's a lot of connection in the Bible to what's actually happens in the genealogy of Jesus. When we talk about prophecies fulfilled in the Bible, the genealogies actually have that purpose. You know, if you just read genealogies on their own, they could be pretty boring to read. I used to find that so as well. But once I understood that they had a much greater purpose, and you actually looked as to why they were actually there and who these people were, and it all came to life, you realise that there was a great power in the actual genealogies. They actually connect the past with the future, and they actually fulfil prophecies. So the genealogy of Jesus is how the New Testament starts. Right? It actually starts by declaring whom Jesus is and how he's connected to all of those who came before him, which are in what we know as the Old Testament. So it has a significant purpose in the Bible. And then we find when we read these stories like this, that there's unique things in the genealogy which are not in other genealogies, because they had a role to play in who the Messiah would come from in the future. So they're all marked in that actual genealogy.